So without any further ado, the primary target of our gathering this morning is to hear from our distinguished speaker, Shin. It is my absolute pleasure to get to introduce her. Recognized for her monumental installations, Shin transforms large accumulations of everyday objects into expressions of identity and community engagement. Distinguished by her meticulous, labor-intensive process, Shin's installations reflect personal lives as well as collective issues that we face as a society. Shin's innovative work has been exhibited in over 150 major museums and cultural institutions. And in the public realm, she also realizes large-scale permanent installations commissioned by major public agencies. Born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in the US, Shin attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 1999, received a BFA and an MS from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and she also received an honorary doctorate from the New York Academy of Art and is a tenured adjunct professor of fine art at Pratt Institute today. Recognition of her early commitment to art, Shin was also a Young Arts National Award recipient in high school and a US Presidential Scholar in the Arts. These are two of the nation's highest honors for high school art students. So her practice that she's sharing with us today has been building up and it's taken off from an early moment in her studio practice. In addition to this work and her teaching, Shin also serves as the president of the Joan Mitchell Foundation and serves as on the board of the Young Arts Foundation and Advancement for Young Artists. So without any further ado, I give you Shin.
Thank you so much for this amazing introduction. And thank you all for being there in the audience. I know this is the hardcore group because it's 9 a.m. and you're here. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen and look at some work together. And mostly I'm really excited to contextualize my practice and then for us to engage in questions and be able to have a conversation with those who are attending. So can everyone see my screen now? It's on the collections page. Any hollering that?
Yes.
Okay,
yes, looks great.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. I wanted to begin that Letitia mentioned my early practice, and I was actually taught painting. And when I was in young arts, I had a painting portfolio. And in that painting portfolio was a lot of portraits of people, myself, my family, and also landscape. So I was essentially a plein air painter. And today, of course, I move, and especially in this platform around sculpture, how did I go from there and a high school art portfolio dealing with painting and the landscape to the now? And so I thought I would share that fact with you because there's so much about the discipline of looking and also being outdoors and the body and the figuration that is still such an important component of my work. And in that space, I sort of thank this one project that pushed me out of my studio, out of my comfort zone into the outdoor element, making what I imagined was an installation. These were broken umbrellas that I rescued from the streets of New York City. And I thought it was so interesting that we protect our body when it's a stormy day, evening, with this apparatus. It becomes a shelter, you know, one person to one umbrella. So it's a unit of a person. And then it's abandoned because we live in a culture where we don't really feel it's warranted to repair umbrellas. And it doesn't seem like you want to carry an umbrella that might have a broken spoke. So oftentimes with one simple snap, and a windstorm, umbrellas abandoned all over the streets of New York, and then the body moves into shelter indoors. So I decided it'd be really interesting to rescue these umbrellas. And of course, I deconstructed it. So there's different parts, the soft components of the umbrella, and then the spiky component, the skeletal, and really did see it as an extension of our body, the internal mechanisms versus the soft skin. And that comes to play about protection and structure. And so I started to reconstruct these and put them back in the landscape. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, these umbrellas were meant to be outdoors, but they only experience the devastation of storms and rain. They never get to see the sunlight. So in different projects early on, this is over 20 years ago, I decided to put these rescued umbrellas that were mended, sewn back, also added holes to them into the landscape. And I harnessed essentially the light and the wind in these sculptures, something I had never planned. In my mind, I was thinking of it like a painter. Here are shapes, beautiful. I would put them together, look at composition, and put them in the landscape. But instead, what I received was this incredible kinetic sculpture. And in this way, extended the trees. The cables were anchored to these beautiful trees. And at Socrates Sculpture Parks, they actually needed more trees and more shade. So the canopy and the shade of the tree were extended by my sculptural intervention. And in this way, the wind would move the piece. And to my surprise, it felt like it was literally alive, breathing, taking a breath. And then the wind would slowly go through, and then it was like the slowest yoga style exhale, and then would gently pick up a wind slowly again. And so to me, I learned so much from what I didn't expect, what I felt like nature transformed and brought to life. And so these ideas really spoke to me, and I started to look for other opportunities of that nature in my practice, bringing work to the public realm. Meanwhile, in the studio, I was also thinking deeply about the body and the objects that we use. So in that way, a lot of my early trajectories in sculpture were based on the found object, the famous Duchampian way, but I took it a few steps further. For me, it was about the transformation of this, what we understood, and not to leave it as a ready-made. But there was so much excess of consumerism, and I wanted people to look really close and start to question, what is this thing? And it's so obvious what it is. It's a pair of shoes. And yet, where did this material come from? Who designed this object? Who uses it? Where did it come from in its origins as far as material? And of course, the shoes that we put on our feet, much like the umbrella, has a relationship to our body. It is to protect it. It's sort of a moccasin in that way. It is another skin made out of leather to protect our own as we go and walk outdoors. And so I started to deconstruct the shoes and create these hides. By sewing them together, I wanted to leave what fashion manipulated and made ornate, but also to move it back into what felt like a pelt, and really literally the animal skin. So I've been thinking a lot about our bodies in relationship to, quote, other bodies. And today, as I work in a space around environmentalism, the fact that we call them other bodies is really quite the problem in itself. If we just saw that we were sort of part of nature and that these were in extensions of our own body. These early installations, the reason I was deconstructing the shoes actually were for the sculptural effect. I wanted to get the soles, the literal leather flattened soles that we have on our feet. And this is an installation I presented more recently in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And these are called worn soles. And what I really wanted to reveal was a side of this object that no one really sees. It's the side that the owners might know about if they happen to look under their feet. But really the positioning of the shoe is that this is never seen. And it is literally the mark that one makes for every step in their life. And I just thought that was such poetry, that the wear and tear of the shoe really talks about the person's past and where they've been, and that the surface is literally transformed. And to me, it was like a surface of drawing, mark making as well. But it speaks also about the privilege of someone's life. If their shoes are barely worn, it means they don't walk very much. And then maybe they get escorted and cabs and limos. And other times there are the walkers, the people who really travel the street. And you might even find holes within the shoes, but the level of comfort. I was recently in a residency called Materials for the Arts. It's a collaboration from New York City's Sanitation Department and Department of Cultural Affairs. Basically, they collect excess and surplus and the waste stream of New York City museums, fashion industry, tech industries, anyone who really wants to donate materials and have it divert from the landfill. And while I was there in residence, I saw leather, beautiful, beautiful leather come through the warehouse. And it reminded me of this project that I was working on very, very early on with pelts and shoes. But this is not from the consumer or post-consumer level. This is really engaging what the industry, the production house, has with leather. And this is what they call dead stock, the scraps of leather that they cut away and leave behind and that they no longer need, can't move. And when you look at them very carefully, it was astonishing to me that they were carefully cutting out what we call the prime spot and leaving behind everything else. And what was the everything else were the beautiful stretch marks, the beautiful pieces of organic evidence of nature, its resilience as well. But anything that had been imperfect or scarred would be left behind. And this extractive process became so evident as I tried to reconstruct the body, the whole. And so what I realized was we're just literally living with leftovers. And I felt like these little scraps of leather were very much indicative of what's going around us in our nature, in our landscape, in the world, that people have been, humans and societies and cultures have been extracting the best parts and leaving behind. And we've been left with these scraps. Early on in my practice, I had an opportunity to show my work at the Museum of Modern Art. It was my first solo show, pretty daunting as an emerging artist to imagine this space, and also all the artists who had been showing historically and into the contemporary space. At the time, as an emerging artist, I was also a cultural worker. I had been working at the Whitney Museum and putting together exhibitions with a cohort of beautiful colleagues. And so I really understood the museum space, not as a space only for artists and their work to be hung on the walls, but really the behind the scene of people at work together to in the mission of showing art and educating the public and displaying this work. So I decided that for my first solo show, I would not, quote, find a found object and bring it into the museum, but actually locate materials that were so embedded that we often don't recognize that these materials and the people who donate the materials are here. And it is really the people who work at museums. So I asked the curator to give me her work clothes and then to negotiate a call for other people's professional work clothes at the museums. So this call for action started to have a new trajectory for my work, that I would work with a partner within an institution or community, and for them to be my ambassadors in seeking materials. They wouldn't have to be rescuing umbrellas from the street, but really having to navigate their workspace and their relationships to procure the materials for me. And also the excitement that their work would land as an artwork in the space that they actually work in. So it started to marriage architecture and the people and material all in one space in this very ambitious first show. So these were the employees' work clothes, and I had everyone from Glenn Lowry, interestingly, he's still the director 20 some odd years later. And also, the curators, the registrars, the art handlers, the guards, so many people who are almost unnamed, right? And are really also the front lines of museums, and how the hierarchies of this, quote, body, the institutional body, lives in this space. But in my sort of mosaic of an installation and site-specific project, they all have space. They all take up space. There is no hierarchy. They're just represented by the beauty of the shapes and their interactions. And so this is kind of an idealism, a society that I wish for, organized purely just in space and time. And it's a momentary hanging, of course. I was also, of course, thinking about Matisse and the cutouts and all of that, the historical ramification of collage and assemblage. I was able to take this project and translate it in a permanent work. So one of my first commissions after that was with GSA, the federal government. And so another kind of shift in my practice to think about how can I take this ephemera and translate it into works of permanence. So thankfully, I worked with collaborations with a fabric conservator who gave me the know-how, the substrate and adhesive to make my fabrics last for a very long time. And she was really guiding me to say, these fabrics actually have been worn, which is the best thing for light fast. They've already had a shift in exposure to the elements and light. So in this building, though, I wanted to map a community that I know very well. So the users of this building were immigrants who were getting their naturalization and citizenship. And of course, that mapped to my own history. I was born in South Korea and come to the Americas and gotten my citizenship with my parents and family. In fact, in this same building in Baltimore. So I had literally an intimate understanding of what it feels like to be an immigrant whose family's identity shifts having gone through the processes of the service that's offered through the federal government. But another community that I was not familiar with that through this project allowed me an intimate understanding was the Veterans and Administration, was also housed in this building up those elevators. And I thought, wow, I chose to go on this journey, or my family did, to come to America. And who are the people who would choose to wear and join the military force or the service? And so I decided to have that same prompt, asking the veterans if I could have access to other soldiers and within their community who would be interested in donating their work clothes. And of course, that's the camouflage. And I wanted to integrate those two communities, those who serve our country and those who come to our country. And I felt like those journeys intersected right here. The minute that they would wear the uniform, they would leave and serve in other parts of the world representing America. And then with the immigrants, they would come here and become American and almost in some way shed their belongings from their home country. But of course, we know that those migration stories are always held within us, within our bodies. And even though we might change clothes, that those identities are really deep and embedded. So I really wanted to kind of map that and also use these communities as my participants. So of course, with veterans, they keep very close contact with their veterans. And so they were able to send out a list and send me the clothing. So I had those volunteers who wanted to participate. With the naturalization and immigration citizenship services, it was a bit difficult because they were getting information all over from offices, websites, through the mail. So they had told me the best way to capture this audience and speak to them and invite them was at the day of this ceremony, where they would raise their right hand and give oath and pledge to this country. So before they started the ceremony, the administrator just handed the mic to me, it was a little daunting to say, before you go and do this amazing, amazing moment, a celebration and history for your day, I wanted to invite you to a public art project, inviting them to donate a work of clothes. So even before they got their citizen was an ask. And before they pay taxes or even get invited to serve in the military, public artist is asking them for an article of clothing. Of course, I spoke with my own journey and shared that with them. And I had such a willing participant. And this man from Greece literally gave me his shirt off his back. Thank God he wore an undershirt, and off he went. Others would mail them their shirts. Others wanted me to take pictures and were there alone and just wanted to commemorate this incredibly special day. And so I realized that the art was serving a purpose, that art was in fact mapping this thing that was so ephemeral in people's lives, and busy lives at that, lives with purpose, lives that go on. And yet permanently in this building would be this journey. I had their countries of origins, their names, all the veterans and the places that they served. So this moment when time was preserved through the work. And so every person who walks through has this momentary pause. Where did this material come from? Who donated it? And those were all the questions I wanted people to have and to celebrate their lives in this moment of time and space. So that trajectory of inviting participants as a way for me to activate that community, to be with the community, to have this material exchange became a strategy in my work. I got hooked, and I was so excited to meet people that I had never had access to, but also to create communities and to have a shared conversation, a shared language, both about the different stories that we had in common. And here was a commission through the Asia Society and Museum. And I thought it was really interesting because it was 3 Asian curators who were putting together a group exhibition of contemporary Asian art voices. And they had really been questioning, do Asian Americans make work about identity? And at that point, I wasn't sure I make work about my own identity, but I had been using the strategy of material acquisition and doing this invite. So I said, well, maybe this is time that I looked at my Asian identity through this invitation. And the invitation was like a call for them to invite others in their community, other curators, other artists, people that they were doing studio visits with, and literally became the mapping of this journey that they were taking to organize this exhibition and even beyond. So I got sweaters from them and every extended community member that they were connected to, and my own. And I started to unravel these sweaters. And the unraveling became a way in which we would reconnect our network. And I felt like networks and communities were sort of this invisible way in which things worked. Certainly before we had Facebook and Instagram and all the social media, I mean, we really literally didn't know who was connected to who. And it was a physical connection. And I just thought it would be really interesting to map that and bring physical form. For me, it was about trying to understand what people say as 7 degrees of separation, how the key peoples in our communities like Christine, Kim, or in Asia Society, we had so many important curators who were really the person you needed to know, the gatekeepers and such. And I wanted to figure out the interconnectedness of our larger community. This exhibition traveled, so went from New York and went literally across the country in the different cities. And then different people were invited. So the project would land and the museum were to activate the Asian American community locally and be connected to the national identity. And it was really a question about how does one identify that word Asian today? And that was wonderful to question that. How does one identify being American? Does it include immigrants, people who have long stayed here with green cards or without? Is it only citizens? And also community. Can you be part of the Asian American community without being ethnically Asian, racially identified as Asian, but being a patron of that community? So it just started to literally unravel our understanding of our identity as well and be so inclusive. But you could also see the tight network at work. I also thought that idea of degrees of separation was kind of misunderstood. It's actually degrees of connection. This project actually allowed me to be more connected even today as I continue to build this project, and it's an ever evolving community that gets added to. I wanted to mention that the kind of practice I'm in is often generated in a site-specific way. And so that means museums, institutions, public spaces invite me to do a project. And usually that comes at a site visit. And I was just saying how I was in Philadelphia to begin an engagement. And it really is, the site visit is so critical to meet people, to be there in that space and respond. It's also a lot of research. So this project that I did at the Smithsonian American Art Museum was a new work. And it was interesting, my own relationship to different sites. So I grew up in Maryland, which was just a suburb of DC. And a lot of my interest in museums happened because I had free access, only a subway ride away to these free institutions. And I kept going to museums as these public spaces. And I realized as a visitor, similarly, they would want to go to the museums and also the monuments. So most of the people who were visiting the Smithsonian were these kind of tourists visiting the Capitol and then also taking in the cultural institutions. So when I looked at the monuments and looking at the Capitol, in relationship to the Washington Monument, I love this space of the void. And I never really understood it from this aerial view, because for me, I was on the ground in the various buildings. But this aerial view showed me the emptiness between those two sites, and how when you're not there, you really see the televised feeling, the National Mall getting filled. And whether that mall gets filled, like in this situation, this is a snapshot, during when I was putting this exhibition together, of crowds gathering for the inaugural presidency, of Barack Obama, and people just naturally came to celebrate. And of course, we know that space is also being fraught with resistance and protests, and also the famous speeches of Martin Luther King and so on. So this was a space for me full of potential, and that the forefathers had really designed it to be empty, because you never know what people want, and the potential of it. And so this idea that I could gather and celebrate a monument for the everyday person, the potential that was maybe unrealized now, but in the future. So my monument was the trophy, because it was an everyday object, often that we have in our life as a child, when things seem so bright, and the optimism that we could do something amazing. At the end of the day, we're not all sports stars, and so we move on. So these little trophies sort of maps sort of bygone days, and in fact, most of us evolved to a profession that's often not awarded or celebrated, and this notion of achievement is so wrapped up in different ways of us acknowledging who's doing that great work. So I wanted to really examine the labor that goes into making our society functional. And that would be the mechanic, the cooks, the nannies, the people educating our children. And I realized this project was in 2009, but today during the pandemic, we've essentially named them as essential workers, and I was calling them the everyday hero, that this was a monument to them, the everyday hero, the person who is really behind the scene of getting us safely to work, taking care of our children if we couldn't be home, and so on. So it's so interesting how over time projects still resonate, and that, we never looked at the often immigrant communities of Black and brown bodies as being so essential to us and our well-being as we have today. Another project I did in New York was collecting celadons for the Flushing community in Flushing, Queens. And so when I did this project, I was invited to look at this train station. And usually I'm collecting materials from the community itself very directly. But I thought this was an opportunity for me to actually go back to my mother country, Korea, and to celebrate the arts and culture there and to bring that to a public space. So oftentimes when I go and visit museums all over the country, people often ask me, where are you from? And then that pause, and when I say Korean, they go, oh my gosh, we have the best Korean art represented. And then they show me the 2 Korean vases that were from the celadons, the ceramic vases that they have, which are attributed to no one. It's anonymous. But it is beautifully made and in the Joseon dynasty. So it is, thousands of years old. And I just can't believe that that is probably the checkoff. We have 2 Korean artifacts preserved, and that's it. And then they're so excited to meet me. And I just thought, like, wow, like Korean arts hasn't evolved or been celebrated or inclusive enough. And there is so much perfection wrapped around this one cultural moment in our historical arts and culture. So I decided to go back to Korea and meet the artisans who literally still continue to practice this craft in Incheon, Korea. And in their production, because they are aiming for this amazing perfection of porcelain and this perfect glaze, they throw away 40 to 60% of their production. They cannot let go of any imperfection. So the artist destroys their own work. So only the best leave their studio. And for me, of course, as you know from my first idea, where does this material come from? What do we celebrate and preserve, and it gets exported and imported and extracted, and what gets left behind? The celadon was another way to think about that in our own cultural history from Korea. And so I took their Korean waste, literally the ceramic waste from these ateliers, generations of their work, but broken shards, and brought them to my fabricator, who then created this beautiful vase. And mosaic is often done with the highest form of Italian glass. And here I wanted to infuse it with the highest form of Korean celadon. But they were shards, no longer making teacups and vases, but in fact, the leftovers, the remnants. And so I did that in the public train station. We also took it and made it into a Zen garden in Dallas and Texas. And then I introduced it to Florida and Sarasota Art Museum as well. So these imports and exports, the Korean vase gets to travel the world into different institutions and spaces and public art, but also to be celebrated for its imperfection for me, because I feel I am not a perfect Korean, but I am Korean nonetheless. And our broken, imperfect identities are one to also celebrate and to continue that legacy, but in ways that are questioned, in ways in which our identities are connected to this rich community in Korea, but also all over the world. And so for me, this was a way of extending that conversation into the contemporary space and being inclusive of our larger Asian American and a kind of a global diaspora. And showing other projects where consumer waste is a way in which we're both celebrating our cultural heritage, but also our identities in the most abstract way. So these are prescription pill bottles. I collect them from the users sometimes, the people who take pills, oftentimes the nursing homes where the elderly are often taking more medication than we'd like to believe, and sustaining their vulnerable bodies through medication. And as we know, again, from the pandemic, how quickly modern medicine is our cure. But in fact, even when the cure exists, as we know, people are not taking it. We're not taking care of each other. And so this quick notion of something will save us is not actually practicing self-care, if not care for the community, care for each other. And so this idea of taking medication and mapping the body, the thing that we don't see as being the most vulnerable, but also how it can transform and save us, was this project that I did in chemical balance. It got me into plastics, which is also interesting because our world is full of plastics, and how this plastic could be seen both in the vessels that we consume. And here the vessel is that these are Mountain Dew bottles. So another, not cure, but a seduction of some sort, our way of consuming this, addictive, often dependent on our bodies and transforming our bodies. So Mountain Dew has one of the highest corn syrup, the fructose corn syrup, so mostly in processed foods. It's incredibly highly addictive, of course, leading to heart disease and obesity and even teeth rot. And they're distributed and readily available through the single-use plastic. So this is a project I did in Iowa where I wanted to have the community bring their recyclables, which was a lot of Mountain Dew, the green bottles, and almost like a Lego set, work with the school children in their public schools, and also doing workshops at the museum to transform this ready-made material that was consumed and left behind for recycling, but in this way, repurposed to make sculpture. And I wanted to make corn stalks because it was literally a byproduct of corn. But unlike farmers making corn to eat as a natural material, here it was being introduced as processed foods in our landscape, and both for our bodies, for its toxicity, but also the runoff in corn production, which is really an industrial size agriculture. So here in this place, I wanted to create a cornfield inside the museum to mimic the outside landscape, the history of the landscape that's been transformed in Middle America in places like Iowa. So it's not really farmers who are making this corn. It's really that industrial agriculture, pesticides, fertilizers, a monoculture is being produced in a factory-like way. And they're producing products for us to consume and redistribute all over the country, if not the world. And that product is then transforming our bodies. And of course, the plastic is also a highly dangerous waste that is floating in both our landscape, but in our oceans as well. So affecting our marine life. What I've done with these projects is go from site specific to site responsive. So I'll take the same product because plastic lasts forever. It just gets maybe, uplifted or downgraded, depending on the recycling. But here in my work, I decided to take it from the ground and lift it up into the air. So it's almost like a cloud, this idea of something floating. And in that way, I was looking at the Winter Garden as a space in which we have this living palm tree in New York, which is such a surreal image, and this idea of the fantasy, idea of the desert, idea of landscapes that we should not be in, but yet are sustainable in this kind of bubble. And so I thought, wow, we are really living in an unsustainable bubble. And if we were in a desert, we would literally be seeing a mirage of this green, thinking it was nature and that we were desiring something so important to us, like a natural resource, a space of regeneration. And yet this was a false illusion because, of course, this is the toxic plastic waste and nothing like nature, nothing nourishing. So similarly, the byproducts of that sculptural, which was the workshops, when we were making those beautiful leaves of the corn, I had, after the workshops, these beautiful end of the bottle, the 2-liter bottles. And I thought the forms are also so interesting. Again, the bottoms that we would never see when they're upright as bottles being ready for distribution. So I made another sculptural form, again, repurposing them into another life, which was this kind of invasive plant form. Again, talking about how plants are also invasive, going from one location and thriving in another, that is really changing our ecosystem, just like the plastic waste is going into our ocean pollution and really turning into microorbs that break down and therefore being consumed by our fish. And of course, harming our marine habitat that then goes into our food chain. So this seems to have, this foreign object body has entered new spaces that again, it's slippery to recognize as them being invasive because they look so appealing and often so much like they're camouflaged into the habitat. But in fact, if you look very closely, it is nothing like nature. I have some other projects that really shifted my gaze of looking at what does nature look like to a lot of more direct ecological projects. And first of which happened because of an invitation at Storm King. So Storm King is an incredible sculpture park with acres and acres of landscape for one to walk through and visit sculptures. And of course, the history of this sculpture happened around the 1960s. A lot of Corten steel vertical sculptures, Marc de Suvero and Calder and even Richard Serra as well. I wanted to be making sculpture in a very different gesture and also not letting the backdrop of nature be only something literally just to make the sculpture look more beautiful in the landscape, but in fact, nature being front and center. When I visited Storm King, nature was in peril. And in fact, these maple trees that is in the main allée of their landscape, the allée, which was a French word for just a canopy of trees along a path, were dotted with these incredible non-native maple trees, and they were dying. So the one on the left is doing okay, but the one on the right is obviously in decline. And the rest of the trees were similar and worse decay than that. So the landscape designers and the museum had decided to remove them. So they were going to get them replaced by these gum trees. And their landscape process is that they would literally chop them down and have a chipper and chip these down to little scraps and have them removed from the landscape immediately. Then the tree is gone until the new planting happens. And what I wanted to do was slow down this process, to acknowledge the disappearance of these beautiful trees, and in fact, allow us to mourn them, to be in the presence of these great trees, even in death. And so I asked them if we can mill this tree as opposed to having it disappear, if we can salvage this body and to treat it like this beautiful wood that we would create a new sculpture. And my sculpture was essentially one falling tree hitting another falling tree, hitting another falling tree, this echoing of tree after tree, this community of trees that were literally dead. So I imagine this almost like it's not a forest, but this line of like a domino effect of trees falling. And so this fall would then create a space, a communal sculpture for us to gather. And you could see here, I left a few stumps at the beginning of this project to talk about kind kind of this chopping down of trees. And then I left the other remaining stumps so you could visit where this growth took place. And then you could see these barely visible in the landscape are the new planted black gum trees that were supposed to be more sustainable as climate change has had effect in this landscape and more sustainable. But for me to have a sculpture in which the horizontal had a function where nature revealed itself, cutaway meant that you could see the beauty of the inside of the trees. Before it disappeared, we could see this material for its life, for literally the grains inside, see its very beginnings to the end when it passed away that past year. And when you gather, what was so beautiful was the sculpture almost disappears in the distance, and you just look at nature very closely if you're sitting on it, or that it's just a gathering of people questioning where the art is, that art is actually nature, that we're all part of it, you know. And you see the stump honoring the deep root systems and how trees communicate today, all the knowledge and wisdom. And speaking of knowledge and wisdom, of course, the maple trees in particular for New York and also places like Vermont and Canada know that it is the sweetness of maple sap that transforms into syrup. And so there's another labor-intensive process that goes to transforming this sap. And it's, again, the gift of nature, the sweetness of nature. And so here I wanted to talk about what does nature also not just look like that we can't see, both its vulnerabilities, but also its strength, its resilience. But what does it taste like? So I had Storm King and their crew harvest just enough sap from a healthy tree, and also the declining sugar maple trees, and also the green mountain ones, which is not a native species, and how that each species tastes different. They yield differently, whether they are healthy or they're in decline. I also left the big trunk. I started to fall in love with the trunk as is before it got transformed in the sculpture. And so this whole trilogy of the next generation that's planted there, the body without its limb, and you could see the little new growth. This tree, even though it's sort of deemed not worthy, is still trying to grow. And then we have the old stump here. That's the nutrients is still flowing into this new tree. And then we have its body transformed once again into the communal horizontal sculpture. So I wanted to just talk about the cycle and the regeneration and resilience of nature. So after that project, I had an invitation to work outdoors a lot with trees. It became that when someone had a dead tree, they could say, hey, Jean, do you want to work on this tree? And in fact, the same thing happened at Olana. They were desperately trying to save this hemlock tree that was in their main lawn next to their beautiful artist's former home of Frederick Church. And this hemlock tree, massive tree on their, so close to the house, was dying. They had been seeing it decline in recent years and deemed it to be dangerous to the house and the safety of the people. So they were going to get it removed. So I worked with the New York State Parks Department to imagine how would we also take this tree body, this one tree, and to celebrate its memory of it. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely to elevate, literally lift it up and have it like hovering over the landscape before it left us, as if the spirit was guiding this tree, for it to feel like it's still soaring once again before it comes to its final resting spot horizontally. Interestingly enough, when I did research on the hemlock, it had a relationship, very deep connection to the Catskills, where I had an upstate studio. as well. And during the pandemic, where I was spending the full year and a half, there were these peelers hired by the tanning industry that would literally take these virgin hemlocks and peel the bark, because the bark has the tannins to cure leather. So in this production, they were extracting the hemlock bark and leaving trees just bare and deforested the entire Catskills Mountains in 5 years for us to have these luxurious leather goods. Of course, that tapped right into this early project. I was thinking about hides and tanning and the products that make them, the industrial waste that's produced, so the toxicities in the landscape from the tanning process, the curing of leather. So it brought me right back to my studio practice and my early work. So with this hemlock, I said, wow, it was so violent what they had experienced. And when we cut the tree, we actually realized that the connection with the 1800 peelers in the tanning industry was directly linked to this tree's birth. So when we counted the rings, it was literally 140 years, which is exactly when Olana was being built, when Frederick Church planted this tree, because he looked across the river, the Hudson River, and saw the Catskills being deforested, and in horror said he's going to plant native trees, including the hemlock that they were literally destroying. So this tree were planted at the intention for it to survive next generations, and it had survived many until now. And so I wanted to reenact that violence and acknowledge what we had done to this, the ancestors of this hemlock tree, and the horror it had witnessed, but also the hope that we had also infused on it from one artist to another. So just like the gift of nature, I thought this was the gift of the hemlock tree to an artist, from one artist to another, from Frederick Church to me. And so we did a ceremony in which we took the historic tools from the 1800s and reenacted that peeling process. And it was really horrific. I could not believe how quickly you can debark something in minutes. And almost how satisfying it was, but it's so bittersweet that violence could come at such a sweet price, and that it could happen so quickly over this one tool. This is a bark that protected itself for over 140 years, and in minutes could be violated so quickly, and death. So after the debarking, this morning of this tree, I wanted to honor the bark and have it be the shadow of this large trunk, leave it at rest for its beauty to be witnessed. And then the next step of preparing the dead with meaning and with care and intention was to create a shroud. The shroud would be made out of the same leather that caused all this destruction. It's kind of, again, unnatural connection that we had brought these two species at its death and at its waste. And so the leather remnants of today's contemporary industry, upholstery, fashion, would then be the dead stock material that would be beautified and adorn this incredible tree trunk. And it felt like I was preparing the dead, meaning I wanted this tree to come and for people to respect it, to give it the most dignity, and also to remember its sacrifice, not only its own body. This tree did not die just of anything drastic as a peeler finding it, but more of natural causes. But today, of course, the hemlock is in another major threat through invasive species. The woolly adelgid is rapidly taking over. So I wanted to feel like at least this one tree would have the dignity, a funeral, a gathering of people coming to remember it. So the exhibition became kind of an open casket where people would come and grieve and mourn. And I realized that maybe they were also mourning this tree and understanding more about hemlocks in the landscape, what sacrifices that they had made and how they were part of this larger ecosystem. But also, I think during the pandemic, we were just mourning in general, our inability to gather, an ability to touch, to give proper goodbyes to people in our community, to our loved ones, to the other generation, especially the elderly in nursing homes and so on. So I was really talking about our own vulnerability. I think we were also mourning ourselves and our own population during the pandemic. But there is hope. So I wanted to take those leather scraps, what some other horrific thing we would do in ranching and so on is brand, our cattle. So I wanted to brand these leather pieces because they were sacrificed for the hemlock and vice versa. And so hemlock identification and trying to look at the species and look at them carefully in our landscape. So the New York State Parks Department has so many acres of hemlock still thriving, doing well. And so I had volunteers and we had scientists go and tag them. The college next door also went with a professor to try to look at hemlocks and identify them in the landscape and then put my little leather tags in them. And they became part of like the beauty of identifying and understanding what you're seeing, that nature's not all the same. Nature's not always thriving, but they need care. And this is a close-up of the woolly adelgid sacs. Each sac, those little white things next to the branches is eating the sap, and then will grow into hundreds and thousands of invasive beetles. I wanted to shift gears. I've also had kind of another practice when I'm looking at the waste stream and looking at everyday objects of post-consumer waste. Technology is one of those big spaces. And so these are mobile phones. So in a project I did right before the pandemic, I was thinking about how we have spent so much time on our phones and how it has changed the way we communicate, changed the way we gather. Ironically, the exhibition was called Pause, and it was looking at the San Francisco and the Bay Areas, a contribution to the internet and technology, how it was a countercultural kind of universal and optimistic notion when it was invented, and how it's also created both a dystopic kind of vision for us, how we're unable to really gather in real space, and how our attention economy and social media has really created just depression, anxiety, and stress. We work too hard and work all the time because we're connected to technology and can be reached. And it's how it has really changed our body. So these were mining and looking at this beautiful Chinese landscape scholars rocks and how they were remade with the technological waste. So while we upgrade our phones, the hardware does not easily get returned and recycled. Instead, they end up in our landscapes and causing incredible harm. And of course, it's the extractive process to create technology in the first place. So of course, we enter the great pause, and here we are still in the pandemic, and we are on technology more than ever. My early works were like this, looking at old technology. Technology has been used, mapped around planned obsolescence. So the minute you get this new technology, the next one's coming. And so this was old 77 records, even before vinyl, and how each of it, when we look at this technology, maps how we as culture celebrate our musical production, maps our generation, and so on. And so I've done a series of projects that really speak to how the digital interface has changed the way we communicate. This was a great project I did in collaboration with the Fabric Workshop Museum, where we literally talked about email technology and how I was an artist of residence and all I was doing was composing emails. And so I thought, like, for every email, if there was a physical implant, meaning for every keycap. So recycling keycaps were used to document our digital emails. And so you could literally read this sculpture, follow our behind the scenes communication, and how communication, of course, was so critical to having a great artist residency and producing artworks. So the artistic production for me was composing an email, and how that email, of course, had physical ramification and consequences. It was also incredibly interactive, and one of my first digitally composed interactive works that I did with the museum. Looking at old technology, I love that we're in a slide format. Even though we're going digital and we're over Zoom, it is still called the slideshow. And this word comes from this physical object that has been one of our first and primary ways in which we did art history lectures, how I learned about the history of art, if I didn't see it physically in museums and galleries and in artist studios. So this was the Metropolitan Museum's slide library. So when they went digital, they let go of their slide library, and we were able to kind of distribute and look at art through this 135mm slide. And you know how precious that film is, its ability to capture colors so differently, but how there was like the original slide versus the duplicate, and a degradation of information when we went that way, which is very, very different from the copies that we have in the digital space. So a lot of this work was really questioning, you know, in our material culture, you know, how value is assigned to things, how there is a degradation as well. There's incredible waste streams and abundance, but it's devastation in our natural landscape. I think I will end there so that I can open up with some questions. But thank you so much for your patience. That was a lot to cover.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jane. That was beautiful. We have questions coming in on Zoom, and anyone who has questions in here will bring the mic to you.
Yeah, please unmute and also share faces if you had your camera readily available. I'd love to see who's in the audience.
You want to read it, Kate, or do you want me to read it? Okay. This is from Rachel online. You mentioned a residency that gave you access to material waste. What advice do you have for artists using discarded materials? What resources like this residency have been helpful to you?
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously the waste stream is so plentiful. I was, before even knowing that it was an artistic project, definitely dumpster diving. So trash day, recycling day, come on, it's everywhere in your own home, in your own closet, right? So there's no shortage of material resourcing. So you don't need a nonprofit, you don't need this whole infrastructure and 10,000 warehouses, but you go just to the local supermarket, you go to the local hardware store, and they've got crates, they've got lots of things that they just need to move, and if you're just polite enough to say, I'm an artist, can I take this? Could you save this to me? My early projects, I just went to like laundry mats and took their lint, took their empty socks, the single socks, went to alteration shops and said, what fabric use do you not use? I mean, every industry has waste. Every person has waste. That is just, we live in that reality, sadly, and more than we could ever handle. So yes, you can start by these amazing institutions that want to share that wealth and want to divert the landfill, but we all are part of the problem and part of the solution when it comes to creative reuse. So just anywhere, like, don't be shy to like use that. Most of my waste stream was literally walking on the streets of New York. People just leave free stuff in a box, leave shoes, leave books, and I just took them. So just look around really carefully and they'll be there. But there are amazing nonprofits. I just was in Philadelphia touring RARE, which is a recology from the demo and construction, but a lot of cities, both in San Francisco and North Carolina, there is a whole network of people doing recycling and redistributing it back to artists for art projects, workshops, or at a very minimal cost. And for certainly hitting your thrift stores and things like that as well. But you don't even really need to pay for it. There is just so much materials, and it costs people to remove them. Dumpsters are expensive. So to know that it's an economic lift if you're able to use it. And as an emerging artist, I was doing it purely because I didn't have to buy materials from an art store. But labor is not cheap. So you're infusing the work with labor, and labor is real care, you know? So there's a shift in our understanding. They're not really free. Someone's paying for it. Nature is paying for it. We're all paying for it. But the cost is at much different end than the consumer price of how much am I paying for it when I purchase it. Unfortunately, the real cost is still so heavy on ourselves and of course in our natural ecology.
We have a couple more. Kate, why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Jean, thank you so much for the really, really informative and enlightening presentation. I very much appreciate it. I have a question specifically about the piece that you did at the Museum of Modern Art. And you said that you had asked a staff member to solicit clothing from other staff members. And I'm wondering if for that project or other projects where you harnessed institutional sort of staffing, did it depend upon who was doing the asking, whether the staff was responsive to that request? And how might that feed into critiques of institutional power?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Well, I mean, I feel like I was in a pretty empathetic space, right? Because museums, of course, it's a project that they're showing, right? So I'm asking within its own institution. So instead of purchasing materials, raising money for materials, they're having to, it's the same system, right? So in some way they're motivated to do that work with me. Certainly I felt like I worked with a great curator. So that was great. And I think she is so skilled at bringing people together to mobilize people. And so, yes, but it was really kind of interesting because she's like, I really don't know anyone in that department. So this is my chance to send an email, introduce myself, right? So it really opened up communication for people to how do you show up? How do you show up and not just ask them to do something, but how do you show up and say, can I offer to do something? Is there something else curatorially we could do better that maybe we haven't? So it really just opened up communication. And it also talked about the dysfunction, how we maybe don't communicate, we don't see each other very often. And the project at MoMA happened at a time when staff was incredibly in turmoil. And that's why I really wanted this project to be what it was, because they were going from MoMA Midtown to MoMA QNS. Staff were furloughed, staff were distributed. This was like the pandemic times, but internally they were going through identity crisis. They were in different buildings. They didn't know who was still working there, who got fired or furloughed or laid off, or who decided I've had enough. They weren't even in the same offices. So this kind of displacement was happening, questioning of like, is this worth it? So I did kind of feel like maybe this was a chance for the community to talk with each other, to meet up, because they need to physically, they could send the clothing through their interdepartmental mail, but in fact, it would be nicer to be like, oh, I've never met you. I want to thank you. Could I meet at coffee? Could I meet you before you go to lunch? Can I, to really physically overlap. So the material exchange does one thing, and how to navigate that is another, but there's so much more value added if done well and done with the kind of honor of that exchange, which is opening up communication and being there for each other and having the right tension. So it's not just an ask, but an exchange. you know. So yeah, Ava Respini did a fantastic job, and I'm not sure I would say someone else could have done a better job. But she found herself in the same space, questioning, wow, I have so little contact in a certain department, and maybe I'm questioning why that is, you know,
Right.
or that
Thank
her,
you.
her department alone is siloed a little bit because it's photography, and how is a hierarchy between that and painting and drawing, you know, so there's a lot of that unpacking one's hierarchy and positions, but for sure it came up.
Thank you very much.
I hope I answered that question. There's more to that idea of the institutional space for sure.
So we have a question from Janet Akelman. She says, Jean, I'm such an admirer of your work. Will you be able to share with us what new project you're most excited about at the moment?
Janet, thank you so much. Of course, I am such a huge, huge fan. It is such an honor, literally, to see you in this space and to share the space with your keynotes lecture soon in this conference. Yeah, well, I feel so just emotional knowing that you're asking me this question. I mean, obviously, you know, space, like taking on these monumental spaces, you know, I'm such a small, petite person. So it's like, oh my God, I get to like traverse space in this way and have a light touch about it, you know? My new project right now just was in Philadelphia, and we hope to do a project around the Delaware River. So it's literally on a boat going down the Delaware River, looking at the ecology. And what I landed on was kind of the research around fresh water mussels and how they're one of the most imperiled species native to the Delaware River, and all the great work that scientists are doing and nonprofits to repopulate them. And so I want to look really intimately at what's happening underground in the beds to repopulate. And they're part of our larger ecosystem, right? So if you affect change there and let them thrive, they need hosts, which are the fish, and they clean the water. And then of course, we're able to drink the water still. So there's this huge long-term mission about the blue infrastructure. And I can't wait to get this project started because it is so meaningful. Of course, I want to do no harm to these mussels. So I'm thinking of like creating a living laboratory, and super excited to talk about how they have been with us. Interestingly enough, they were, of course, depleted in all parts of the world for the pearl buttons. So there's also like the Hemlock violence and extraction and removal that we have done. So of course, in Philadelphia, there's other issues around industrialization and pollution. So it's so interconnected, all these ideas. So I'm deep in that research and really loving my partnerships with scientists right now. Thank you so much. I'm super excited about this project.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been a really awesome lecture. I have a question about your collaborations with, I guess, experts. You talked about the piece for GSA and working with someone to help you secure adhesives and create something that was gonna last. So in the sculpture world and in public art, you know, there's this tradition of bronzes and core 10 and institutions and collectors and cities and things want to see work that will last forever. But crossing this human threshold of a very important threshold where now we have more human waste and materials, man-made materials, than biomass on our planet. So, I mean, we have this responsibility as creatives to shift how we're making things. Can you just talk a little bit about approaching collaborators and experts to create work that will last longer in a way that's accepted by these institutions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really rich question, and probably have, we could talk a lot about what does it mean to be sustainable in our life, what does it mean to be sustainable in our practice, and what does it mean for arts and culture to be sustainable, including, permanent public collections and museums and institutions. So there's a full ecology there of our society at work. I would start with GSA was the administrators were the first to suggest that I work with a conservator. So that was wonderful. Like it was an area that I felt I didn't know very well. I didn't know what to do with my ephemera and these used materials. And so, they gave me funding to work with a conservator, which is great. And so now I know to ask for that. I also know to budget for that moving forward, that if I need material expertise, working with a collector, conservator, or working with a fabricator and really doing material studies. And of course, they don't often know, like they only have a best guess at what this material could do. So a lot of it is what they would do is the similar kind of testing and experiments that you do in your own studio. So their labs are just kind of like, well, this is my hunch and we won't know until we test it, So I found it to be a really reassuring that we don't all have the answers, but they've certainly worked with it in different ways, and they can be assured to suggest materials that do work. And so if you follow within those guidelines, that you have a better assurance of that. But this is all about maintenance. Nothing's going to last forever without care. And so if these institutions would care for these materials, life would be long. The fabric conservator said, of course, I have works that are as old as Egyptian time, it's just that people need to hire me to conserve them and to care for them. And also the conditions of care, right? The environment, the harsh conditions that need to be more conducive to these things. So I don't want them to be locked up in some storage. I would love it to be in living public spaces, but that requires a lot of navigation. So certainly working like in this project right now in Philadelphia, I'm working with all these different expertise, I'm picking their brain. I'm asking if they would meet with me, take an exciting journey with me. I also want to amplify their work. I want to acknowledge their work. So this was not be like Jean Shin project. It would be Jean Shin in collaboration with and all their workshops. We can really tie them back in when the work is presented, and a lot of their mission is aligned to say, like, we need visibility around this work. So I present the public visibility. So there's a real mutual respect and partnership when I work with expertise. There's a lot of joy in figuring this out together. So acknowledging what you know and what you don't know, but what you're excited to learn about, and what space you share, but what space another person's expertise is really required and needed. So I work with a lot of fabricators, and I think my questions push their practice, and then they just kind of at some point go, I don't know, but it's worth trying. And so they're super excited about that conversation and want to engage with me. I think your question around, I would push back on the field and say, what is permanent? Like that just doesn't exist. We're in a climate change crisis. What is permanent? I think we need to question what we're saving what for. And so I think the urgency of the now is really important. Obviously, we want to save things for the next generation. So ideas of long-term is really important, but just for conservation's sake in a bubble, in a silo is also problematic to me. So I do think it'd be lovely to be able to use materials that have a wear and tear, that naturally want to create entropy, and want to naturally go back to the recycling process to be regenerative. I think all those, can't we celebrate that process as opposed to like stopping something? Because I think it's usually a precious material, like you said, a corten steel, these precious materials. Some of them, of course, can be recycled back, melted back. But not all materials have that same integrity. So I think our aesthetics needs to change, our redefinition of quote permanence and our relationship to that word needs to change too.
So I want to thank you so much for such an inspiring
truly inspiring presentation and body of work. I have a couple practical questions. The first one is, when you were working on that keycap project, you have it listed as one of the materials, high performance laminate fabric. What is that?
Well, I mean, I'm working with a fabric workshop, so they are experts in this field. They know their material. So it's a really it's a material that is incredibly flexible, but also have structure within it. So you can puncture holes, and it would also have like a weave that can hold some heavy keys as well. So again, it's because my project managers have worked with this material and could advise me on the exact material to use. But this is, again, like I knew about Biva film and also, ways of using aluminum substrates. All of this comes from the industry of people who just have used this materials to high performance. So thank you for that question. I'm sure if you contacted the materials, the fabric workshop too, there's a whole archive of our project, along with other artists, these archive boxes, and I really talk about the process of experimentation and have a lot of that data there too.
And then secondly, collecting ephemera to the degree you're doing, where on earth do you store it while you're working and collecting it and maybe doing multiple projects? And then how many people do you work with to execute it?
So, that's why I have this barn upstate in Kingston. So I'm both in New York, but also upstate, and really upstate has helped me a lot because this barn is now getting completely filled. So I hope to place more works and get it out there, but I try not to collect as many materials if it's readily available somewhere. Like, I don't necessarily need to collect plastic bottles because soda bottles are just in our waste stream all the time. So I can have a nonprofit or recycling center and reach out to them when I need them. If they're cleaned, I'll hold on to them because that's a lot of labor I don't want to repeat, but if it's a special item that cannot be readily sourced, then of course they come to my studio, or someone donates something incredibly meaningful to me, I will hold on to it. So I try not to just have hordes of material, though, I think people who visit my studio will say, oh my God, it's really filled with these things I've already collected. So that said, so I have a barn, it's totally maxed out already. I'm hoping not to move into shipping containers, but that might be the next step. But mostly it's working with those institutions and those partnerships. So right now, I don't actually work with assistants, but if people come my way and I feel like, oh, they could be helpful, I might hire them on a project basis or an intern. I like to be nimble right now. I like to be flexible. I like to be just really hands-on. I'm teaching right now. It's the pandemic, I have these big projects, and I know I'll work with fabricators, collaborators, but they might want to work with their own team. So I may bring on projects. I just taught at Chautauqua. There's a lot of Chautauqua alumni in Philly, so I'm going to be tapping them in a couple months to see if they're need a job, and I can hire them for a project. I love using local, so it doesn't make sense for me to have a whole team based in New York when projects are elsewhere, So for me, it's like, how can I mobilize in local communities and embed them? And they're my primary audience. So I actually feel like even my hiring of assistants is the community that I want to build. So it's another exchange that I'm having. So I'm honoring labor as being part of a resource that can be meaningful, as opposed to just, it's my labor, I employ these people, and we're making all the work. I just want to be more generous and be like, it's a creative labor. Obviously, there needs to be attention, skill, and a long lead up to learning, but that learning is a pleasure. And I have all these meaningful people who want to engage in my practice, and they can do it inside out versus looking from the outside.
Hi, I have a question about some of the pieces that you have outdoors. Are they temporary or they are going to be permanent? Like I was thinking on the tree and the leather. is going to be like, is part of your process or idea, the environment and the weather, or you just want to keep it looking like that for a while? So I am interested on see if the evolution of time and weathering is part of your intention with it.
Yeah, so certainly I've been thinking about this a lot. And this project of Olana, it is the wear and tear. Sun is hitting this leather. Leather's not usually exposed to this much sun in a whole day and a whole season, if not a whole year. So it's gone from bright colors to pale colors, just like those umbrellas. So that is something that I want people to witness, that materials, again, aren't forever, and the exposure to our elements. The end of this life, I did question, what can I do? I can't hold on. It's one exhibition. It's not meant to be forever. And what I wanted to do was really play the next chapter out. That tree should go to rest. It's final. I talked about it as a funeral. So now it's the final space of rest. And so I'm going to have another ceremony upcoming. And if anyone wants to join me and Olana, we're going to have a ceremony where we remove the shroud. And the shroud is now the container of the body, and the body will be let go. The body will decompose in nature. So I'm going to remove the shroud, which is a lot of labor because every little tact. And then the shroud could live on, I'm hoping, and be shown, exhibited. It's almost like a relic, a reliquary, you know, and to be talking about who was this body wrapped around, and, you know, this tree, the story of Frederick Church and Olana. So I feel like that can have a story that continues, while this tree, then we're going to have a big bonfire. We're going to have sort of a cremation. I'd love for parts of it to be transformed to another art material, like a charcoal that could be regenerative of another drawing. Then it can also decompose in nature back in the hemlock groves. It could feed its own new generation of hemlocks that are in need of nutrients. So I'm hoping that nature will be regenerative, but I'm also hoping that a second version of this work, paler with some wear and tear, could be exhibited indoors as well. So I'm
Jane,
thinking I'm thinking in those lines that you're just discussing. How can, in my practice, kind of play with the cycle of life as being integral to the meaning as well?
That is so beautiful, Jane. Thank you so much. I look forward to following the information about those ceremonies and that idea of regeneration. We need to conclude right now. We have hands up and emails, our continued comments online. And so I'll collect those and email those to you separately. So in that way you can hear and read what it is that people have continued to be able to want to share and say to you. So, but thank you so much for sharing all of this information. It's been enlightening. And there is still the coffee talk later. So those of you who are going to be joining Jean Shin for that, we look forward to that more intimate conversation. So with that, thank you.
Bring your questions for sure to the conversation. I just also put my Instagram. It's a good way to find me, message me, follow my projects. And I'd love to hear from you all, and we can be in dialogue again. Thank you so much for your time. This is so attentive and so appreciative.
Thank you.